We are reading from Jonah chapter 1. Jonah chapter 1. This is on page 753 in the Pew Bibles. Page 753. Jonah chapter 1. It reads, "The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me." But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea and such a violent storm across that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God. And they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us so that we will not perish." Then the sailors said to each other, "Come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity." They cast lots, and a lot fell on Jonah. So they asked him, "Tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you?" He answered, "I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." This terrified them, and they asked, "What have you done?" They knew he was running away from the Lord, because he had already told them so. The sea was getting rougher and rougher, so they asked him, "What should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us?" "Pick me up and throw me into the sea," he replied, "and it became calm. I know that this is my fault, that this great storm has come upon you." Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Then they cried out to the Lord, "Please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, Lord, have done as you pleased." Then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. Now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. This is the word of the Lord.
It was pitch black. I remember racing through the shrubbery and the thickets, my heart beating, racing. I was hiding, but I'd been flushed out, found, and I needed to escape. And I was 13 or 14 as a camper, so I didn't yet have mortality on my mind. I was not going to be caught by the counselor in our game of it was a modified capture the flag, if you will. We called it Roman soldiers. It had some Christian overtones to it. But I was convinced that Jerry, even though he was in the Coast Guard and much more strong and fast than I was, Jerry wasn't small like I was, and he certainly wasn't as foolish. So I ran and cracked through the bushes, and as he called after me, until finally my feet carried me no further, not because my legs couldn't, but because the ground had disappeared. And my legs flailed through the air as I fell. I don't know how long enough to think, this is a problem. And a huge crash, and in the dark of the night, and Jerry was left on the hillside, not foolish enough to jump after me and calling after me, "Hooper, Hooper, are you all right, Hooper?" But I had escaped. I had run, fleeing, and I was free for the rest of the game. I found the hideout of the secret church. It's a great story, and the next day we went back and tried to figure out where exactly was that, and it was quite a story for the books when we found the place where I landed amongst this tree that looked like it had literally split in half. But the reality was I was running, in a sense, to get away from being captured. And today Jonah is doing just that. He's running away from being captured by the mission that God has for him. And like some of us, sometimes we may feel like we're inadequate or we're uninspired, just not ready for it, or we're tired, or we're unsure of the reception of how people will take us. But maybe we too sometimes run from the purposes that God has for us. And so we hear a good news from Jonah, even though Jonah is kind of an anti-hero. He's kind of the opposite of what we should do. But we hear some good news from even this first chapter in Jonah as we get into the story, and we'll get into this continuing story the next several weeks, that the power of God's message overwhelms the failings of his messengers. So we start with Jonah. Who is Jonah anyway? The word of the Lord came to Jonah. Jonah, his name means dove or pigeon. His father, Amittai, means truth. But if a dove is kind of a symbol of peace, then his message that we'll hear in chapter 4 or chapter 3, 40 days until destruction, means that the truth of it is that he's more of a pigeon making a mess underneath the roof eaves than a dove. His name's meaning doesn't mean much in the story, but in 2 Kings chapter 14, we hear his name again. It's the 15th year of Amaziah, son of Joash, king of Judah, which if you're like me, you might say, well, when was that? It was about 800 years before Jesus. Somewhere around 793 BC is when that 15th year would have been. And this king, Jeroboam, the son of Joash, becomes the king of Israel in Samaria, the northern kingdom. So the southern kingdom, the northern kingdom, Jeroboam, that's where he reigned for 41 years. And in the northern kingdom, about 800 years before Jesus, Jeroboam was an evil king, as this passage makes clear in a few verses. But he was the one, in verse 25, who restored the boundaries of Israel from Lebo Hamath to the Dead Sea in accordance with the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, had spoken through his servant Jonah, son of Amittai, the prophet from Gath-Hepher. So that's an area within the region where the northern tribe of Zebulun would have been. And Jonah was a prophet up there, and he had prophesied somehow to this king that he would take back some of the land that Nineveh and the Assyrians had taken from Israel. And this is an interesting thing because he's preaching, or he's been brought a word from the Lord that seems to be for this wicked king in Israel, or at least that he would gain some ground here. Whereas Amos and Hosea are famous for their oracles of doom against this very king and his religious syncretism and his social injustice. But it was clear that even in Amos and Hosea that this was a period that the northern tribes experienced some prosperity. But like Nahum, Jonah is another minor prophet that we come across in our Bible. Nahum also really points out a lot of the evil of Assyria. So here are two evil kingdoms up in the north, and Nahum says, "The Lord is good and a refuge in times of trouble. He cares for those who trust in him, but with an overwhelming flood, he will make an end of Nineveh. He will pursue his foes into the realm of darkness." And so Jonah is more like that. He's not a particular fan of Nineveh, as we will find, even though that's where he's sent. And this book is a little unique. It's like a biography. It's like a prophetic narrative, kind of like the later part of 1 Kings and early part of 2 Kings when they talk about Elisha and Elijah. Or that's like 50 years or 100 years before Jonah. Okay, so Elisha and Elijah before Jonah. Jonah is right at in the middle ages of the northern tribe, before they get taken away to Assyria. And then Daniel is a little bit later, right? It's after the Babylonians come and destroy Assyria and take over Judah. And so Daniel a couple hundred years later, but the beginning chapters of Daniel are kind of the same prophetic narrative, which is the stories of what God does with the prophets and around the prophets, and a little bit of their messages as well. So as we read many of the minor prophets, all we hear is their messages. We don't learn much about who the prophet is or where they're from. It's almost like a minor detail. But here in Jonah, we're going to hear a story of what God does in Jonah's case. And today we're going to see that there's a power in God's message that is even going to overwhelm the failing of his prophet Jonah. So, Yearly can put up the slide there as far as the breakdowns of some of the verses here that might help us. But first off, Jonah refuses to go. Jonah refuses to go. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai, "Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me." But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port, and after paying a fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. So, he's called, just like Abraham was called, get up and go. Go to where I'll send you. But unlike Abraham, who got up and went, Jonah gets up and flees. It's striking. There's no comment from Jonah here. There's no words of Jonah here. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, and usually in the other prophets, the next words are the words of the prophet that came to them from the Lord. But here, Jonah is silent, and he just flees. The wickedness or the trouble that is going on in Nineveh has come up before God. He wants Jonah to go and represent him in Nineveh, to proclaim to them his displeasure at their wickedness. But Jonah, instead of going up to Nineveh, goes down to Joppa. He goes down into the boat. He goes down into the under part of the boat. Jonah ran away. And all week, the song, "And I Ran" from the Flock of Seagulls has been going through my head. I can't get it out of my head. But just like other prophets, we know other prophets, Isaiah felt unqualified. I mean, Jeremiah agonized over the oracles that he was given. He didn't like the messages he was given, the truth that they held, and what they meant for his people. Amos admitted with resignation, he said, "But the Lord has spoken, so who can but prophesy?" In other words, I don't even like this, but the Lord has spoken. I have to prophesy. But contrast that with Jonah, who says, maybe if I run away, at least I don't have to be the one to bring the message to Nineveh. And we'll see the reason for that later in chapters 3 and 4. But he goes down to Joppa. Now, that's not 26.2 miles, as the marathon runners today. It's about 36 miles. So Jonah probably didn't run. He probably didn't race there. But he travels down to Joppa, which is a port that was never really occupied or owned by Israel officials or people until much later in the Maccabean time. So these are Phoenicians, likely, or Canaanites, who are these sailors, these Gentiles who have other gods. So he goes to a port where he knows that nobody there is going to know about Yahweh or his proclamation for Jonah. And he finds a ship that he can hire. Not only does Jonah refuse to go before the powerful message of God kind of overwhelms his fleeing, but we see that Jonah refuses in the moment when he's most overwhelmed, he refuses to call out. Let's look at verses 4 and beyond. So Jonah gets on the boat, he goes down below. Then the Lord sent or the actual Hebrew word threw. He threw a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. And all the sailors were afraid, and each of them cried out to their own God. And they threw the cargo of the sea in to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us so that we will not perish." So Yahweh, Jonah's God, throws this great wind upon the lake. This is the Mediterranean Sea. They're going out towards Tarshish, which there's several places that are named Tarshish, but it's like saying the word actually means open sea. So it was kind of like a word like Portland, where there's a lot of them because that's where the port is, in Portland. So Tarshish could have been a couple different places, but it could just mean out into the sea. And so they're going out into the Mediterranean, and the Lord has thrown this great wind, and the contrast here is between Jonah and the sailors. The sailors are just calling out for anyone that they could believe would listen. Their own specific gods, their family gods maybe, the gods that they worship as a people group, their nations and gods, calling out for mercy. And Jonah is not only silent, but he goes down to take a nap. And as if it's not clear enough, the way the narrator clearly juxtaposes those two things in one verse, he has the captain come out like the Greek chorus and just say it out loud. What are you doing? How can you sleep? Get up and call upon your God. Maybe he will take notice. But Jonah falls into a deep sleep. Now, twice this week, I have had very good sleeps. It was wonderful. And I thought, man, this must be what it... But it was even a deeper sleep. The words here are the words that the writers use when Adam is put into a deep sleep and God performed surgery to create Eve from flesh of his flesh, bone of his bone. This is the same sleep that God causes to come over Abraham when he causes a vision of the sealing of the covenant. I will make a covenant between you and your descendants. And he falls into this deep sleep. And so Jonah falls into this deep sleep. And it reminds us of Jesus. Because Jesus fell into a deep sleep on a boat, just as a squall came up on the Sea of Galilee. But the difference is, when Jesus is awoken, he doesn't cry out, but rather he calms the sea with his own words. Again, doing something that only Yahweh has the power to do. Jesus again showing that he is God. But in Jonah we see this striking silence, even when the captain says, "Call out, maybe your God will take notice." But Jonah knows that the problem is not that Yahweh hasn't taken notice of them. The problem is exactly that Yahweh has noticed them. It is Yahweh who has caused the storm because Jonah is there. And again, the power of the message of God is overwhelming the reality that Jonah is fleeing, disobeying, failing to be the messenger. But not only does Jonah refuse to call out to Yahweh, as all the other sailors are doing, Jonah refuses to answer and to fess up. Verse 7, when the sailors say to each other, "Come, let us cast lots to find out who's responsible for this calamity." They cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. So they asked him, "Tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? What is your people? What people are you from?" Verse 9, he answered, "I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." And this terrified them. And they asked, "What have you done?" They knew he was running away from the Lord because he had already told them so. So they go and cast lots because he hasn't fessed up. He hasn't called out to his God, but he hasn't exactly said to them, "By the way, I know what's going on. I know why this storm is here." They cast lots, And as Proverbs 16:33 says, the lot is cast into the lap, but every decision is from the Lord. And these lots would have been like yes-no dice. They kind of look like dice to us, but they would have had the opportunity for 25% to be yes, 25% to be no, and 50% to be roll again, So maybe like one of those. But this is a common practice in the people groups of the Mediterranean and the Levant, the Semitic peoples, to discern the wills. And so the snake eyes fall to Jonah. And they ask these rapid-fire questions. Who are you? What are you doing? Why? What's going on? Who are you from? And Jonah's testimony to this polytheistic group, each of them, would have had a personal deity, a family deity, and a national deity. This time period was a time period where the national groups of peoples were growing in the influence in the area, and so it was more and more important what national deities they were worshiping. And so here they're imagining that Jonah's God may be just another one of the gods that is a regional god. And Jonah says, no, I serve the Creator God, the God of heaven who made the sea and the dry land. And they would have understood, maybe in their mythology or their understanding of how the gods worked out, that was a greater God or a more distant God or more ancient God. But they would have understood that this was a God who had authority wherever they would go. And that's the funny thing, is that they understood that, and yet Jonah somehow had missed that. How does Jonah know that he's the creator of the sea and the dry land and not know that he's still in God's jurisdiction? So they're terrified. And maybe his lack of terror reveals that he had already determined what his knowledge of what was going to happen was going to be. But they're terrified. That's appropriate. This guy has violated the command of the greatest God. And we know the only true God, the only real God. And that is who is stirring the waters. That is who has brought the storms. And Jonah, who has refused to go, has refused to call out and ask for help to the God that he does know and who has sent him. And now he refuses to even answer, even though they know this is who it is, other than saying, this is the God I serve. He hasn't answered as to why the problem, why the storm. But the power of God's message is going to keep overwhelming his refusal. So the sea is getting rougher and rougher in verse 11. This is the second increase of this, the throwing of the waves against the ship. And so they asked him, what should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us? Pick me up and throw me into the sea, he replied, and it will become calm. I know that this is my fault that this great storm has come upon you. Finally, he fesses up. Verse 13, instead, the men do their very best to row back to land. But they could not, for the sea grew even wilder before them, the third increase of the storm. And they cry out to the Lord, to Yahweh, a God they didn't previously know or worship. They say, please, Yahweh, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man. For you, Lord, have done as you have pleased. And then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. So here, Jonah has an opportunity. Presumably Jonah could have jumped in himself and said, I'll solve this. I know what Yahweh wants. But he refuses. Jonah, in the midst of the second turbulation and this third turbulation, as the sailors say, maybe if we just drop him off on dry land, that, send him back the way God wanted him to go. But God's having none of it. He's keeping the boat right there. But Jonah makes the sailors to be God's instrument to calm the storm. He makes them make the decision to pick him up. And that's their consternation. Like, do we have blood guilt on our heads now? Are we taking on some responsibility if this is really a prophet of this powerful God? And so they cry out, forgive us for doing this. This seems to be the will of your message. So, Jonah and God seem to agree on one thing, that it's best if Jonah be thrown into the water and presumably drowned than to go back to dry land. And so that's what happens. When he was in prison and facing his execution, Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote a poem about this very scene as the sailors lifted Jonah. And I'll read it for you. He says, in the face of death, they screamed and strained to hold the soaking ropes. Creaking in the wind and the wild scene appeared in full horror behind the sea's tumultuous waves and force unrestrained. You gods, eternal, ever good, who now offense betoken, save us or give us a sign that we may know who with secret sins has made you so. Murderer, blasphemer, or one whose oath is broken, one whose hidden wrongs have brought us to this evil, that his pride might profit as best it can. Thus they prayed, and Jonah spoke, I am the man. My life is forfeit. I opposed God's will. Cast me out. My guilt incurs God's anger still. The righteous should not perish with the wrong, they trembled, but their hands were strong to drop the guilty, and now the sea was still. This is quite an image that our narrator gives to us, that poem kind of draws out. But again, it's the Gentiles, it's the people who are just being exposed to the name of Yahweh who are the ones who are asking, please, Lord, don't let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man. For you, Lord, have done as you have pleased. See, the power of God's message of grace to the sailors is overwhelming even Jonah's refusal at each step. His message of accountability to the prophet is overwhelming. There's not a way out for Jonah to just hide underneath a deck or go on a ship or be dropped off at land and try a second time. The message of his authority over the wind and the waves and the storm is overwhelmingly clear. And their response, verse 16, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. They reverenced him as his authority, the greatly fear of the Lord. That's meaning they worshiped him. They sacrificed. That would have been later on to give thanksgiving to the Lord. They wouldn't have the ability to sacrifice on the boat. They'd thrown everything overboard. This would be at area temples when they returned. That would be temples that were serving Yahweh, where they went and offered thanksgiving offerings. And they gave vows. Not only did they give offerings once, but they vowed to continue offering sacrifices and following Yahweh, continued devotion. We don't know if that meant that they got rid of all their other household gods, or we could ask all kinds of questions. But what we know is that the message of the power of who God was changed for these sailors that day. The power of God's message of repentance overcame Jonah's failings, and these sailors responded. Jonah's poor character and his petition were not what changed the minds of the sailors. It was God's own hand. And then the response we'll hear more about next week. The Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. And next week, Pastor Zephaniah will tell us a good fish story. But the message of hope for us, as we hear this anti-hero, this example of what not to do when following the Lord, is that in Jonah, the whole book of Jonah, these 4 short chapters, the central question that God is asking Jonah in chapter 4, couple times, is what right do you have to be angry? What right do you have to be angry? His enemies, the Ninevites, he decided, did not deserve the word of the Lord, did not deserve an opportunity to repent. These sailors did not deserve the right to safe passage, did not deserve the right to know that God was heavy upon Jonah and chasing him down, that this storm was of his causing. But God's relentless love overshadowed Jonah's failings and his shortcomings, just as God's relentless love overshadows our failings. He gives us an opportunity again and again to return and to see his long suffering, to see his patience with us. He gives us an opportunity to see his grace at work in others. But ultimately, even when we stumble in our ability to communicate who God is and what his love has done for us, the power of God's message often will overwhelm when God is moving in people's hearts. So this is good news even as we meet the scoundrel Jonah and this message that we will hear about in the coming weeks of his love for people that extend even beyond Samaria and into Nineveh and beyond. The power of God's message of grace has always overwhelmed the many shortcomings his messengers have had through the years. We're going to take communion as we think about the power of the message of grace. Our ushers will come forward. Jesus entrusted the message of his death and resurrection and his grace for all of mankind to a core of his disciples, his early believers, the early church. He entrusted the truth of his message to fallible people like you and me. And as we remember what he did on the cross, we remember that he continues to use us, and his message goes forth in strength because of who he is.